The next session we have is a panel session with some of the people who got us here today. These are the people who had the vision and the fortitude to get us through to this. I look at the group here, and we'll bring them up one at a time, and each of them will talk about their various experiences. Interesting enough, I think I worked for 3 of these people at some time in my career, moving through EM. But the success of the sites, again, comes from the Department of Energy and the focus we have. It comes from the contractors, it comes from the communities, and very much so it comes from Congress. And so some of the successes we have, such as was mentioned, the cleanup caucus and everything. Our panel session today, I think we have representatives from all of those groups who will give us their perspective moving forward. So with that, I will get us started by introducing our first speaker, Tom Grumley. He was an assistant secretary here for the EM program from 1993 to 1996, and really set us on the course to where we are today. A lot of good work early in the program. So with that, Mr. Grumley.
Good morning again. So my job this morning is to try to take us back to the future a little bit. I am sorry that actually the person who started the program, Leo Duffy, was not able to make it here today. And I want to begin actually a little bit with talking about the circumstances that Admiral Jim Watkins and Leo found themselves in 1989. I then want to talk a little bit about, the overall political environment that existed then, some of the constraints and things that happened to get us where we were in 1993 when the tables turned and the Clinton administration came in, and then just talk about a couple of the significant things that happened, and it seemed as though happened to me while I was there and had the opportunity to serve. So I just want to take you back to the beginning of the George H.W. Bush administration, and Admiral James Watkins has just become secretary. He's been former chair of the Joint Chiefs and the Chief of Naval Operations, so this is a man who likes to get things done. He's in office 4 or 5 months, and the Rocky Flats raid happens. And while it may be difficult now to think about an issue making its way to the Washington Post or the Congress, I guarantee you in 1989, when the Rocky Flats raid happened, i.e. a major raid on a DOE site, that made national news. And so he plucked Duffy, who had been working for him for many years, and said, "Duffy, fix this!" And Leo said, "Yes, sir," and proceeded. I don't know if Paul Grimm is here. Is Paul here? I saw his card. Hey, Paul. With Leo, in the space of like 2 years, they put together an organization. They went from $350 million, I believe, in the 1989 budget to about $5.5 billion for the 1993 budget. And Paul was reminding me yesterday when I saw him that he hired in the space of 18 months 2,300 feds. And of course he had the gaggle of contractors that had all been used to working on the defense side of the equation, where it was clear that the technical problems and the national security issues that surrounded nuclear weapons would frankly take precedence over the amount of money that was being spent. So, by the time we get to, and Leo and Secretary Watkins managed to work their way out of the Rocky Flats disaster. And so by the time we get to 1993, we have had the end of the Cold War. This issue has been put front and center on the DOE's agenda. And we've got a whole bunch of new laws in place, too, that have been passed during the late 1980s that are here. The one that affected me the most was the Federal Facilities and Compliance Act, which my general counsel, then Bob Nordhaus, came into me one day and said, you know what, they could send you personally to jail if you don't comply. And what that meant in those years was you had to at least ask for the money that you needed. So we go over to the Office of Management and Budget, and Leon Panetta is the budget director at that point. And he says, well, how much money do you think you're going to need? And the secretary then, Hazel O'Leary, says, how much do you have? So you get a sense of the kind of, and the shock that brought across the face of civilian budgeting. So I'm in office 1 week, and the chairman of the Senate Appropriations Subcommittee and the chairman of the Energy Committee, Bennett Johnston, calls me up, says, get your ass up here. Yes, sir, Mr. Chairman. And I go in and he says to me, you're going to get $6 billion and you're not going to get any more, because if you get any more, you're going to eat the department. So figure out how to make it work for approximately that much money. And then he says, and how long is it going to take? I said, I don't know, it took us 50 years to get here. There's no reason to think it isn't going to take us 50 years to get out. And he said, well, he was like shocked at this. Pardon me, my glasses have just disintegrated. Another metaphor for the EM program. Excuse me for a second. Whether it's the video yesterday or my glasses today. So we're in a situation where, this is a gigantic problem. The Cold War is over. The governors of the various states are no longer in the mood to say, well, just do what you need to do, because obviously this is a national mission. No, this is like, gosh darn it, these are our states, our sovereignty. We're not having you send your nuclear, into our states. So we're in a very interesting time in which, and I wish I could tell Congressman Newhouse that things were easier back then, but they weren't, okay? People didn't want this stuff in their places. And you know what? The dirty little secret is that for the most part, we didn't know how to clean it up. There were all kinds of science projects that were underway. Everybody had, every idea under the sun. At that point, the program had a $300 million research budget, which later went away because it wasn't clear that it was producing really what it needed to produce. So a tough situation. One of the things that I recognized right away is that the cleanup was not a technical problem. It's a political problem, small p political problem. We worked very hard then, and I'm happy to say that over the years, as far as I can see, everybody else has followed up. We tried very hard not to have this be a partisan political issue, because if it had ever turned into a partisan political issue, the program would have no money today. And we also had to recognize that while on paper it's a federal program, it's really a state federal program, in that not a whole lot can be accomplished without the agreement of the states. So the job of the Assistant Secretary, when it's being done well, I believe, is not to be the Chief Technical Officer of the organization, but to work with the leadership in the states and in the Congress and within whatever administration you're in, to persuade people to come together to keep making this thing go forward. And, you know, I would underscore what Representative Newhouse said. So a dramatically different political environment from what had just been in 1989. People didn't want to hear the words nuclear weapons. Communities were actively, they thought we were the enemy. I used to joke with people that people thought that I just deposited my ethics at the front door of the Forstall building every morning, went in, tried to screw them all day, and then picked them up on the way out at night when I went home to my family. I mean, there was just active antagonism. And I know the next speaker is going to speak some about the involvement of local citizens, so I'm not going to steal the thunder there. But suffice it to say that one of the main things we did, imperfectly, I agree, was to try to reach out to the communities around the country, bring them in to the processes, show them, to the extent that we could, how difficult the cleanup was and how difficult some of the choices were, and try to get away from some of the antagonism. I think we were some successful in doing that. I think it's a continuing issue. The Rocky Flats experience made it very tough. But, you know, I think when I think back, I think that getting out of the attitude that DOE knew best all the time, and into an attitude that this was a joint project between states and feds, and that the people who lived around these places had to be involved. That didn't mean, I would tell people straight up, hey, you're not making the decisions here. I'm making the decisions, you know. But I swear to you that I will listen to you and try to take your views into account. And, you know, I think we did. And I would send that as a message to the current leadership that is in an even tougher situation with respect to money, and that is, you got to reach out. You can't think that this is simply a federal program. A couple of funny things, and then I think funny. They're funny in retrospect, but they weren't funny then. I still wake up at night sweating from what I call the Leaning Tower of Fernald. And Jack Craig here knows what I'm talking about. You know, and this was a very good metaphor of where the early days of the program were. Jack and, I forget Phil's last name, who was the site manager? Phil Hammer, had invited me to come out to Cincinnati to watch the implosion that our colleagues at Fluor, I believe, were going to undertake. And, you know, the guarantees were all around. Oh, these guys have never failed to implode a building that they saw. There's no risk here. Meanwhile, you know, in the background, my boss, the secretary, is saying, you're an idiot to go out there. Don't do this. But, you know, I'm in this kind of outreach. Hey, we got to get everything going. So we go out there. Every politician, every member of Congress is there. And, you know, they've got the plunger and the whole thing. And so we push the plunger, and this huge mountain of smoke appears about, I don't know, maybe 1,500 yards away. You can't see anything. And when the smoke clears, the building's like this. This is, I mean, you talk about a stomach churning experience. I just think, well, your career's over. You know, I hope you have a backup as a typist where you can do something. And I figure, well, I'll be fired for this. So I get back and I get a phone call from Hazel, and she's laughing. And those of you who knew her, she had this cackle for a laugh. Better you than me, I told you. I said, well, can I come to work Monday? She said, you better. There's nobody else who's going to take it. So, you know, it was like, okay. A lot of things seemed to go that way at first, as we were working very hard with the contractors to try to try to get things right. And I have to say, everybody that I worked with in the contracting community was, really diligent in trying to make this thing work. But again, when you're trying to blow up a building or implode a building that was built to withstand a 5 megaton blast, we didn't have a lot of experience with that in those days. So, that's one thing that stands out. On the more positive side, right after I was confirmed to this position, it became clear to me that we had these hundreds of tanks, the underground tanks at Hanford, and one of them, tank 106, was bubbling, and John Wagner was the site manager at that point, and I can remember asking him, well, John, what happens? What's the worst thing that can happen here? And he said, well, a hydrogen bubble can be created. It can flip over the contents of the tank. It can explode, and we'll be contaminating the entire northwest part of the United States, depending upon which way the wind blows. Oh, good. What are we doing about that? Well, we're not quite sure yet. A year later, on the 4th of July, they solved the problem, and I still have on my mantle the American flag that went up on the day that particular disastrous risk went away. People would complain to me about Rocky Flats. Why is nothing happening here? I said, why don't you come out here with me? I'll show you why nothing is happening. Okay, so we went out to Rocky Flats with one of the members of Congress. He had to suit up, he had to do the whole 9 yards. It took us like an hour and a half to get into the facility and another hour and a half to get out. Once we were in, it took us a half an hour to get the regulations down about what we could do that day and what we couldn't. So we leave the building at the end, and I said, okay, so we were here for 8 hours. How long do you think these folks can work in here every day? He said, I don't know. I said, well, try 2 hours. We were in a situation where you could only work for, at most, 2 hours a day on an 8-hour shift. And you want to know why it took things a long time to happen? Because the uniqueness of the problem was so great, and our ability to solve it still wasn't up to snuff. The last thing I'll say is that, again, this happened early on. Fortunately, it hasn't happened too many times. But I was awakened at 2:30 in the morning by a phone call that said that we had just killed a worker at Hanford, that he had been burned to death with a steam pipe at Hanford that didn't work right. And is Willis here? Where are you? Yeah. Willis and I got on an airplane and went out to Seattle. The worker was still alive at that point. We were able to visit with his family, try to comfort them, although there wasn't anything we could say except, hey, we care about what's happening. And at that point, I said to myself, we really are going to focus on health and safety here. And that focus, I think, is one that has carried through for the last 30 years and needs to be burnt into everybody's mind every day. You can be dead before you know it at these places. But that reminded me that I was not in Kansas anymore, and that we had this huge process. We did this Beamer study that indicated that it was going to take $250 billion to clean it up, and again, the secretary went nuts, said, you can't put that number out. I said, why not? It's the truth. In fact, it might be an underestimate of what it's going to cost. Oh, it'll just raise. I said, no, we got to let people know what the magnitude of this problem is. And I guess I'm I'm glad to see that 91 out of 106 sites have been cleaned up, but I think it's still clear that there is a major effort, at least another 20 years, to match the 50-50 thing. And it won't surprise me if, when I'm in a wheelchair, and I hope still in my dotage, to celebrate the 50th anniversary with many of you folks, hopefully being able to fly the flag and say, this is almost over. The most challenging position of my life, the best people that I ever worked with. I think we all know feds are, have taken it on the chin for a long time, no matter what administration is in office. I want to say to you and to the people who are in the contracting community who are here, you guys do fantastic work. You're incredibly dedicated. The people at the DOE are among the smartest feds in the government. And of course, that's what makes you all so difficult to work with, because you just won't say yes unless you believe it. Thank you.
Thank you, Assistant Secretary Grumley. Next up, we have one at a time or two. Both up, or you first? Okay. Next up, we have from ECA, Seth Kirschenberg, to talk about communities and redevelopment and how we can continue to work together and partner with our communities at our cleanup sites. So with that.
Great, thanks. Thank you very much. I'm really glad I got to follow Tom also, because the reality is, does this work? All right, if you could forward the slide, and forward it one more also. I'm really glad I got to follow Tom, because when I look at really the program and what's happened over the years, it went from a program where it wasn't thought of as an open program to one where you and the people that you worked with really did a lot to do a lot of outreach to the communities and to work together, and it really changed the dynamic, I think, that had existed. What's interesting is, Mayor Church, he's the person who hired me at Energy Communities Alliance. And he always tells the story about the first time he went to the Department of Energy after his site was announced to be closed and was going to be turned into a cleanup program. He always says that basically he was told by the department, we don't need to talk to you. You're just a local government official. We only need to talk to regulators. They're the ones who oversee us. And the reality is, he just probably ran into somebody on a bad day. But it's something that really kind of motivated a lot of the organization. The organization, Energy Communities Alliance, was started because the communities, Mayor Thompson's here, who's one of the original members, but Phil Najelski-Eichner, who worked for the city of Oak Ridge at the time, got together with a couple of different city officials at a National League of Cities meeting, and they all were trying to compare notes about what was going on in the Tri-Cities, what was going on in Oak Ridge, what was going on in Savannah River, in Idaho Falls. And they were all hearing different things because there were different experiences going on at the different sites. And they said, we really need a voice. We need to get together and actually figure out what's going on. We need to be educated as to what's going on. We need to get some of the transition. People in our communities are being laid off. Don't forget, thousands of workers at the time were also being laid off at the sites as we were transitioning from communities that focus on weapons production to cleanup. And so there was a huge impact, and Rick's going to talk a little bit about community reuse organizations. But it was something that we were all really focused on as communities. And they got together and they built an advocacy organization. Some of the first things that they did was to make sure that there were things like community reuse organizations set up. And they worked with Doc Hastings, they worked with others, Tony Hall, Senator Glenn, Senator Allard, a lot of others, Senator Domenici, Bingaman, to make sure that there were programs that were set up to help the communities and to help the workers transition. Bob DeGrasse, who I know is not here, headed that first worker transition. Oh, he's over there in the corner, headed the first worker transition office that helped a lot of those communities. There were also laws passed. I remember I got a call from City of Richland, and Pam was probably in the meeting. The manager, we were trying to pass a law that basically focused on giving communities indemnification if they ever took land from the Department of Energy. And the manager at the time at the Hanford site got on the phone with me and said, if this law passes, not one single piece of land is ever going to transfer to anybody. You've got to be careful. And we knew that this wasn't true because the Department of Defense sites, they already had that particular benefit. Congress then moved forward and passed a law to ensure that that happened. It was also a clarification that the Department of Energy can transfer land at no cost to the communities. I'm talking through these things because, as Tom said, the communities had a different viewpoint at the time. What we've seen over time is the partnership was really built sometimes because the community, the state, and the Department of Energy actually had to work together through a lot of very difficult issues. And luckily we had a lot of congressional support to make sure that those discussions were very clear and they occurred. Sometimes they occurred through special legislation to clarify how something worked. Sometimes they occurred through meetings and working through things. I threw up some language in this slide on the history because the reality is in the end, we all focus on the partnerships and creating our goals, but a lot of times it starts with a no or a maybe or something else, and it's something that we still work on as we're kind of going forward. If we can go forward one slide. I go through this, if you can keep going to the next slide. One of the other things that I want to talk about really is Federal Facilities Compliance Act. I got involved in this world. I was working with EPA, Federal Facilities Enforcement Office, strangely enough, at the time that the law was enacted in 1992. I just graduated from law school, and one of my jobs was to go around to the different federal agencies and to talk to them about how this would be implemented. And there was a lot of fear, there was a lot of concern. But we've got to also remember that at the time, there was a lot of conflict with the state regulators. What does cleanup really mean? What are we really talking about here? There were unbelievable amount of meetings that were going on, bringing the Department of Defense, Department of Energy, Department of Interior, as they were all looking at downsizing on really what do we mean by cleanup, because at the time, cleanup really meant residential level of cleanup. And how clean is clean became a huge discussion as we were trying to work through these different things. And there were all these different groups that were getting together. One of the other groups that was getting together is Keystone Group, and Tom Grumbly helped actually set that up for those of you who don't know. And really that was a group that was set up. It was the Department of Defense, Department of Energy, EPA, led by Tim Fields, and a lot of others, along with the states, the communities, the tribes. And everybody was just trying to figure out what was going on, what everything meant. What does risk mean? How do we define it? That book goes through and tells communities what that means. How do we do community involvement? That set up the site-specific advisory boards at the Department of Energy. And it also said, hey, by the way, don't just check the box. You also need to talk to people as you're going through. It spent a lot of time talking about budgeting. So there's reality here that we can't just clean everything up and do everything at once. You've got to understand what these things are. And as you look at the beginning of the program, those are the things that really set things up going forward and made sure that people understand what is really going on at these individual sites. And there are things that we still deal with now. And it's funny, I was putting together these slides, and one of the slides was on end states. And it was developed like 8 years ago. At the time, end states meant something totally different, but it was funny as I was going through that we keep kind of going through and dealing with a lot of the different issues. One of the conflicts that I like to talk about, because it's a conflict that ended in a very positive manner, was really, and Paul will remember this, and I was really happy to be on a panel and see Paul as well, because there's different people over time when you're dealing with different assistant secretaries and acting assistant secretaries. There's those that you walk in and they're immediately, one, they're going to tell you the truth, and two, they're going to actually try and work with you. And those are the people that we appreciate as we're going forward in these things. And I just remember Paul put himself through this very difficult meeting that we all went through to try and define these risk issues. And I think it's made a difference over the years. I know he walked out of there saying, "Oh my God, what did I put myself through?" But it was one of those great meetings. But at Rocky Flats, we were, David Abelson and ECA staff put together a report. So after the Rocky Flats and malware cleanup, the Senate put language in defense authorization bill that said, let's do some reports, let's actually know and remember what actually happened at these sites. And ECA worked with Jim Werner, Department of Energy, who worked on the Beamer report, to actually put together a report on lessons learned. And it was funny, as we went out and we spoke to the people at the Department of Energy, the regulators, the community activists, the local governments, no one remembered the conflict. They all just said, yeah, we did a good job, we worked this out. And then we said, well, what about this? Oh my God, that took us 2 years to get through that particular issue. Or what about that? And that took us forever. And one of the things I always like to talk about is really the cleanup levels, the soil action cleanup levels. And I remember it because my members were yelling at me. They were saying, how come we're not doing more? And they were yelling at basically everybody, I think, as they were trying to go through. But we were able to work through what does cleanup really mean at that site. And as they were working through land use and everything else, they'd already decided that it was going to be basically a preserve. And it was going to be open space. But what's the cleanup levels? And there was still some mistrust, I guess, by some in the community. And what the department did, and I credit Paul and Jesse really for doing a lot of this, is they said, you know what, here's where we are. We're going to actually give you funding to actually have your own experts to help the community come up with these issues. And they were able to actually resolve the cleanup levels. So now at the end, we all talk about successes. And that's something that I think is critical that we learned about. When I also talk about this, I always talk about, everybody has different viewpoints about what's important. And basically, we like to follow Mark Twain as we kind of get these things, get your facts straight first, then you can distort them as you please. And we all kind of believe different things as we're going forward through these programs. And so we like to think of ourselves really as the customer. And then over time, we've really built that up. But really, when we're talking about cleanups, and there's workforce, there's a lot of different things going on at these particular sites. And what we've learned throughout history is if we're able to identify what those goals are, and I really look at that when I think about this risk-based contracting or these end state contracting, what does end states really mean and who's coming up with those particular end states? And we all have different ideas of what those are. We all have different ideas on what completion is as we're going forward. And we've all learned what those various different things mean and what is really, how do we reach our objective. In the ECA bulletin, for those of you who saw it, one of the things I focused on was really the people. When I think about the people at the sites, I really think of the contractors and the Department of Energy people who work at the individual sites. I also think of them, and as I talk to my members, they're the Rotary Club members. They're actually the elected officials a lot of times. They are the Little League baseball coaches. And they're really the critical people as we go forward. They're the people who have done the work, as Todd likes to say, as we're going through these things. But they're the people who have really made the difference. And when we talk about the 30 years, those are the people that I really think of as we're going forward. I'm not going to kind of go through this based on time, but one of the things I want to talk about is just as we've kind of gone through the lessons learned, and I'm going to tell another story as we go forward, because these are all things that are true today, and these are things that we kind of talked about when we wrote that Politics of Cleanup report as we go forward. You notice how we didn't call it cleanup, we didn't call it community cleanup. We called it politics because of all the various parties that are involved, and everybody has a different role really as you go through. But really definitions matter, and it's funny with this end state contracting piece, the first 4 months that I heard about this, I kept thinking, who's defining end states? I didn't really think that this is just a contracting mechanism and it's IDIQ contracting. It took me a while to figure that out. And I know that now we're talking about whether we call it next states or whatever else. But those definitions become critical. In our board meeting, we talked about a lot about that. Knowing and understanding the other party's goals, and Tom got to go through a lot of those different meetings, especially in the beginning, when everybody was saying what they wanted, but they weren't necessarily hearing all the other parties. So Tom talked about, you've got to understand budget, you've got to understand the real issues that people are dealing with. I know my members weren't hearing that in the beginning. By the end, they were hearing that because they were all educated. And that's the one thing that we're trying to do as we kind of go forward in ECA. I always say DOE has to engage the community, but the community has to engage DOE. And so we kind of push back on our members as well. Some of the other things, I'm not going to go through all of these, but it really is about working together in relationships. But one of the things that I also tell my members, it's also about not just accepting what you're told on everything. So I'll never forget, I was in a meeting with the folks in Ohio at the Mound site, and everyone talks about Mound, we got it done and its closure. And I remember sitting in a room, a conference room there, and we're talking about the removal of the landfill. And basically, the Department of Energy was saying, there's no way we're going to remove this particular landfill. Don't have enough cleanup money. We're basically done with the job here. The community, though, basically said, I get that you're telling me that, but this is important to us. This is going to be important for the reuse. And it probably took about 5 years. It took a powerful congressman who was head of appropriations to make a difference to get that site cleaned up. But that actually happened. The landfill was removed. And I tell people that because you've got to have that same vision. You've got to create the different vision. And it probably took longer than it needed to, but it's made a big difference for that particular community. And it's something that I now know that the Department of Energy says is a big success as we're going forward. So the thing I want to leave you about ECA and in the 30 years is, in the end, and I truly believe this, and I know my members who have been around for a long time truly believe this, it really is the working relationship and the partnership that makes this thing work. Our folks, just like the Department of Energy is going to tell us what their priorities and move forward. Congress is going to tell us what the priorities are and moving forward. The communities are going to do the same. And then working together to try and figure that out, and that solution is really the key to making this work, and that's what's made this work over the past 30 years, and I think that's what will make it work now kind of going forward. So anyway, I just want to thank you.
Thank you, Seth. Next up, we have from the Savannah River Community Resource Organization, Rick McLeod, to continue this discussion on community interactions and how we can get to the end states we want to.
Well, Seth threatened me before I came up that he was going to say something about my tie, which he didn't, but it's awful hard to be in eye candy for ECA. I don't have a skinny suit like the executive director, and I'm not sure any time in my life I could have worn a skinny suit. So this is more a facade of an old building, if you will. You have to make it more presentable for people to see. So before Seth got to it, I wanted to jump on that immediately. I'm going to talk about almost 30 years of community reuse organization success. Let's see if an engineer can learn how to work the slide moving forward instead of a lawyer. So Section 3116 actually initiated the creation of the community reuse organizations. And going back to the future, if you can remember during that time frame, that was also the time that the base realignment and closure was going on in the Department of Defense. So they were setting up what they called redevelopment authorities. These were the authorities for the bases that were closing, and DOE was following suit with the community reuse organization. They made a commitment. Legacy Management actually provided funding to have the CROs getting established and to work towards economic development. Some other issues I'll get to. There were 15 community reuse organizations across the DOE complex. As Todd pointed out in his slide with the dots on the map, as some of those sites disappeared, so did the community reuse organizations. So they had mainly three functions. They were to collaborate basically with the communities, kind of act as a unified voice, if you will. Workforce retraining and restructuring was a major component the CROs will work towards, and also economic development. Again, these are some guiding principles. I'll go through 2 slides with these. I'll point to the last one for time purposes. 10 CFR 770, CROs were specifically identified as one of the entities to work towards as far as transferring land for economic development from DOE facilities. Keep that in mind as I go forward and mention that later on. Also, I'll point to the lower part of the slide as well, in that we were also supposed to disposition excess personal property from DOE. So those were 2 major issues that community reuse organizations were working towards. A lot of the funds that we received early on from Legacy Management, a lot of the CROs implemented regional revolving loan funds to get industry started in the local area. Some CROs are still doing that. We are not as a CRO, and I'll touch base on that a little later as well. So let's bring us up to the future, kind of to remind DOE that the CROs are still out there, or at least some of us. There is actually language in the House Appropriations report that is moving forward to do just that the CROs are out there. They're a DOE designated organization. That's an important point because I think there's misinformation or folks have forgotten. The CROs are not an EM organization. They're not an NNSA organization. They're not a legacy management organization. They are a DOE organization across the board that can be utilized by any program office within DOE. So as this House appropriations move forward, we understand Senate has a similar language, and you may actually see that language from encouraged go back into directed, because a lot of folks, the CROs, have been a lost entity, and I'll get to some benefits that I think the contracting and DOE could be utilized for the CROs moving forward. So let's get to the existing ones. You'll see actively functioning designated CROs. Tri-City Development in Hanford. They're active in the personal property to a degree. They were also active in land transfer. Doc Hastings had to get an act of Congress to get land transferred to the Tri-City Development Council as a CRO. So it's not been an easy process, even though 770 has been out there for a while. Croat, that's the CRO in Oak Ridge, has been extremely active in real estate. For those that are well aware, Oak Ridge, the city, and the reservation are basically side by side. You can get a building, put an insurance agent in it, or do other commercial development. It works well. Other sites are not so close to a location. So these are the ones. Paducah and Sodi are also working very heavily for land transfer, personal property as those sites close. We took a very robust on personal property. Then you'll see some other sites that are there that are really there. They're designated, but they're not really acting in a CRO function. We were known as SARDI, if you thought SRS CRO was hard. Savannah River Regional Diversification Initiative, chartered in '93 before the actual CROs came up. We are designated, all CROs are designated by the site, but again, mandated by Congress. We changed our name in 2006. You ask why, I think Seth mentioned this. This is the employee curve. So you can see in the early 80s when K-reactor restart, some of you remember that, that number of employment workforce went down significantly in about 3-5 years. So that's the period that CROs, this workforce restructuring was going on across the complex. We have 2 states, 5 counties. We have 22, I have 22 bosses, 22 members, 11 from each state, Georgia and South Carolina. Part of that is because 30% of the workforce at Savannah River Site live in Georgia. Our programs mirror the functional programs, economic development, workforce, and community issues. You ask, what's an asset transition program? This is how we get the personal property from the site. We actually have evolved. Initially, we brought trailers to the site. They were loaded with personal property. We took those off the site for resale value. We started getting smarter and said, well, why do y'all need to have the expense of loading our trailers? What if we just came out and picked those items up at the point of generation? So that ended up saving everybody money and got our equipment to us a lot quicker. Then we said, well, what about asset for services? Are there assets that you could give us to do services for you? We have currently disposed of D&D of over 60 office trailers for the Savannah River site at a significant cost savings for the site as well. What do we do with that money? Everybody thinks I have an office at the Taj Mahal. That is not true. So only 20% of the money we recapture for operating expenses, 80% is given back into the community. Over the last 5 years, we've given almost $4.5 million back in the community. I know to you contractors, that's a spit in the bucket, but to the local community, that's a big shot in the arm for workforce training and economic development. One of the big keys that we have used, and I saw LM here, it was real estate license agreement. That allowed us to go into the site and become the landlord, if you will, for a designated area to remove property, move it into a personal property, detach it, and then use it as personal property and resell it. So going back to the need for real property, again, like I said, it's been, you would think it would be smooth. It was very smooth for Oak Ridge, not so smooth for the folks out at Hanford, and we have yet to get involved in the real estate property side of the house, but are very welcome to do that at some point in time. So what are the benefits? Community reuse, property transfer, I mentioned those as well. Direct community investments, you saw how much we have provided into the local area based upon the sales that we have done. We're also doing site-specific studies and reports, and other CROs have had. When DOE divided up the contractors at Savannah River Site, initially owned DuPont, Westinghouse, did their own impact studies. When they divided that up into multiple contractors, they didn't have that in the budget, and no one was picking that up. So we have already done 2 of those, and probably will do another one in the coming year. M&O cost avoidance, I mentioned the trailers. We have actually, to date, the number I have seen has been close to $10 million in cost avoidance for DOE to do some of the activities that the CRO is doing. We're low labor costs. We do not operate under the contractor requirements. We operate under DOE requirements. So we basically operate under OSHA commercial standards as opposed to under the contractor standards. I need to write. So we're a low cost also for federal agent for grants. We just received notice of a $5 million grant from NNSA. That's in addition to a $5 million that we have. So we're the physical agent. Our overhead rate is about 1/10 of what the universities or the contractors are charging. So CROs can be a very benefit to your organization as a physical agent. And you're waving at me, but okay. We're also a site advocate and also congressional interaction. We do, and we can say things and do things on the Hill that a lot of times the DOE and the contractor cannot do. So with that, I'm done.
Thank you, Rick. Next up, we have a longtime DOE employee. I've worked with him actually at RW, but Paul Golan currently is out at the SLAC office in Berkeley office. But I think he's going to talk today about Rocky Flats and his experiences there.
Thank you, Tom.
Thank you.
So, Tom, I learned 2 pair of glasses, okay? So thank you, everybody, for coming this morning. It's been a long time. It's been 13 years since I worked in EM. And I would just want to share 3 lessons learned today in terms of what you can take back to your sites when we get done with this. But before we start, I'd like to remember 3 people who kind of got this program going. The first is Assistant Secretary Al Alm, who came up with the idea of a 10-year plan and forced us to figure out what we can do in a finite period of time. Second would be Mark Silverman, my old boss, Keith's old boss, who had the courage to bring incentive-based contracts to D&D and cleanup. And Mark brought the first CPIF to Rocky Flats, and he put cleanup front and center in a place that 10 years prior was the site of an FBI raid. And last, and there's probably some new people in this room who probably have not heard this name before, Ed Helminski, founder of Exchange Monitor Publications, who was the social network before there was a social network. He brought us together, published on us, and held us accountable through his various publications and forums. So remember the 3 people today who made this possible. A lot has been written about these closure sites, Rocky Front, Alden Mound, Ashtabula, Columbus. There was other places that we had significant impact on, Test Area North, M area, the K areas at Oak Ridge, of course. But there was a lot forgotten. And today I'd like to just remind us of 3 things that we might have forgot back from that era that may be relevant today. The first is the right stuff from the start. On many fronts is critical. Second of all, a principle-based approach to start, but an outcome end state vision to finish it was at the heart of the process. And third is that the model we used, the processes that we used 15 years ago would still work today. So let's start first with the right stuff. By that I mean the right contractor, the right feds, the right support, the right community, the right contact with our elected officials. Unless you align all these up from the start, things get really hard. And what you find out, 10 years passes and you realize you didn't get much done, okay? The department was responsible for the strategy. That strategy was the 10-year plan, where meaningful cleanup could be accomplished and thought of in a period of time that we can all recognize. When I talk about the right people back at DOE, it's both the headquarters and the field folks. From the contractors, it's not just the people at the site, but it's the parents. Again, the regulators, not just the EPA, but the local regulators. In terms of how we had an adversarial relationship to start, Tom, when I was at Rocky Flats, we called our regulator Gaddafi. And it was the Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment. We called it Gaddafi, okay? The right contract with the right incentives would incentivize and enable outstanding performance, and at the same time, disincentivize bad behavior, bad culture, and bad performance. We placed high incentive for the contractors to bring their A-team to the games. At Rocky Flats, we had an end state contract with a total project of roughly $4 billion for Kaiser Hill, who was our contractor at the time. And if Kaiser Hill hit all its performance milestones, they could earn $460 million in fee if they met all their performance scope and cost and acceleration objectives. If that doesn't get your attention, I don't know what will, right? Additionally, Kaiser Hill shared 20% of their fees with the workforce. When I was there, the average steel worker, and Alan, you can correct me if I'm wrong, the average steel worker left when we finished that project with a check for $65,000. We made it worth everybody to pitch in and come up with ideas. On the other hand, if we had a bad thing happen, like a fatality, the contractor could lose $37 million. Think about that when you compare that to an OSHA fine. Our target date was December 15th, 2006, and I think everybody understands we completed that project and met the end state and declared it finished in 2005, October of 2005. Fernald was very similar. Closure contract structured pretty much the same way. We had a $2 billion contract with approximately $250 million worth of fees available if the contractor met all its cost, schedule, scope, and safety incentives. We had a completion end date of December 31st, 2006, and we completed that project in November of 2006. One thing we had in terms of end state and closure contracts, we had 7 end states for Rocky Flats. Statement of work essentially revolved around 7 end states. One, you had all the buildings gone, demolished. And we noticed the second one is we had to close all our RCRA operating units. Well, what about all the plutonium and all the residues that y'all had? Well, you can't knock down the building unless you get that stuff out first, so we didn't incentivize or didn't have an end state to get rid of the materials, which we had to do to take the buildings down. We had to get all the waste removed, put a closure cap in, or caps that were installed, foundations covered with 2 feet of fill. All surface water on site and water leaving the site had to meet either federal or state requirements. DOE was also held accountable with something called GFS&I, and I know that's a term people use today, but what that meant is government furnishes services and items. And if we didn't produce, we were held accountable, and the way the contractor held accountable was through equitable adjustments. And at the end of the Rocky contract, we had 1 equitable adjustment. So it took all parties from the start working to make this happen. Second is that it was a principle-based approach, outcome-focused. The first principle to accelerated cleanup and closure was that worker, environmental, and public safety would not be compromised. We talked about a fatality fee of $30 million. That was the same as if we had a release or if we lost special nuclear material. We also had penalties for more minor issues. Whether it was a Category 2 incident for a $2 million fee reduction, or Category 3, which amounted to $250,000. So everything wasn't a $30 million hit. In order to encourage the contractor not to hide or to misrepresent what was going on in the field, if the contractor didn't report and we found out about it, and we found out the contractor was trying to, let's say, cover things up, a Category 3 would become a Category 2. So a $250,000 fine became a $2 million fine. See, I got less than a minute left to go. I thought I had 15 minutes. I guess I had 5. One of the things we also found is that contrary to popular belief at that time, production and safety had to work hand in hand. And we learned by doing, and the more we worked and the smarter we got, the safer we got. So anybody who thinks that production and safety can't work in tandem, come back and see what we did at Rocky, Mound, Fernald, Test Area North, any of the places we closed out. As our production increased, our safety statistics also improved. And in 2004 and 2005, Rocky and Fernald had the 2 best safety performance records in the Office of Environmental Management. In terms of principle-based, as Tom said, as Seth said, it meant that everybody was heard and listened to. It also meant that everybody had a compromise in things, and it also meant that not everybody got, or everybody didn't get everything what they wanted. But we committed to maintaining a strong relationship, an ongoing dialogue with our community advisory boards. That was critical as we worked through some very difficult issues in terms of how clean is clean when we left the site. We built strong relationships, and today we would call those partnering agreements. We were partnering before the department coined the term partnering agreement. As I said, there were trade-offs, especially in soil action levels, where we engaged the community in terms of how clean was clean. And if I read the newspapers today from Denver, not everybody's happy with those end states. But what we got is a fairly clean site, and at the end of the day, excellent was the enemy of something very good and something people could live with. And that's, I think, one of the key takeaways here today. The first myth is that we were one big happy family. Well, we were one big family, and like every other family, we had our fights, we had our arguments, we had heated fights, and so we were like a normal family in that regards. And we got a lot of things wrong. We hurt a lot of people's feelings, but at the end of the day, we did have a view that mutual respect between and amongst the parties, and dropping our personal egos, focusing on the end state and our common objectives was the only way to get to where we needed to be. So let me talk to you about outcome focused and turning loose the innovation of the workforce. When I got to Rocky Flats, and this is back in the production days, 1990, when we thought about taking apart a glove box, we would do it like we put it together, with ratchet wrenches and QA bags, and it took us about a year when we tried to take out a glove box in Building 776, a year to take out a glove box. And then somebody said, we're not going to reuse it, let's just cut this thing up. So we used saws, we used these reciprocating saws, and we were able to get about one a month. Well, it was a dirty, nasty work, as Tom said. The amount of time people spent getting into bubble suits to start the day, getting out of them for lunch, and then to get back to them at the end of the day, it was a very difficult task. Somebody had a great idea. Instead of saws, we used torches, plasma torches. We were able to get about one a week at that point. Yeah, that's pretty good, right? One a week. And then one of the steel workers said, hey, if you just give us a bigger waste box, we won't have to cut these things up at all, or at least just make a couple cuts rather than into hundreds of cuts. And at that point, we were able to get one glove box cut up or disposed of a day. And we had over 1,000 of these glove boxes to get rid of at Rocky Flats. My point here is we didn't know how to do our mission when we started, but we committed to being a learning organization. And the learning organization was set forth, the burning platform of that learning organization was set forth by the contract, by the closure contract, where everybody was incentivized to pitch in and figure out how we close Rocky Flats. Again, same thing true with Mound, same thing true with Fernald, same thing true with Test Area North. I had an issue with Representative Simpson when we painted big red X's on some of the buildings up in Test Area North, and he was questioning why we did that until they were knocked down a couple of years later, and he was, of course, very proud of his people for accomplishing that very tough mission. So don't be afraid to learn by doing. The last thing I'll leave you with is that this model can work today. It's in the application where it gets difficult. For the feds, this is not a fire and forget contract, okay? Nor is it the standard Mark 1 Mod 0 micromanagement affair that I think we've all been guilty of from time to time. It requires the contractor management to be completely engaged, and for the contractors not to expect to get everything handed to them. There's too many mother may-I's in the complex today, and there's too much of a distrust that's preventing us from doing our work. It also requires that the contractor bring its A team and its A game every day, all day. And it requires everybody to think. In other words, just like any investment, just like any great expedition or undertaking, it's going to require people to take risk, to trust each other, and to work out of their comfort zone. The CPIF contract, the cost plus incentive fee contract, has proven to work, to drive down costs, to accelerate work, and to complete its mission. But like any powerful tool, okay, in the wrong hands or operated by the untrained or the unwilling, becomes a very dangerous instrument like anything else in life. Most of the time, these contracts require the skill of a surgeon with a scalpel in his hand or his or her hand to work issues. Occasionally, it needs to come down with the force of a lumberjack's axe. Again, the only way these contracts can work is if all parties are willing and believe that the only way to get to where we need to be is working together because our success is mutual. Which brings us to the my third myth here is that, can't see, I've gone blind since I've left EM. The third myth is that just a couple of people made this happen. And I'll just by looking at all the people in the room and remembering what we did at Rocky Flats, truth of the matter is, after we had the original idea, after we put this in place, we know what we need to do. We don't have to invent. We need to reimagine. This contract approach survived Y2K. It survived administration changes. It survived continuing resolutions. Heck, it even survived Alan Parker running the place for 2 years. And if that isn't a testament to a contract that works, I don't know what is. So let me put this into perspective today. When we worked on the accelerated closure and we put these CPFs in place, between 2001 and 2004, EM's cleanup liability decreased $26 billion to $249 billion. In 2018, and this is all contained in the U.S. government's financial statement, that liability in 2018 grew $100 billion. Okay, and today that fiscal liability that each and every one of us is going to pay is $495 billion. And think about that, after 15 years and after nearly a $90 billion investment, the cost to clean up has doubled. Okay, which brings me to my last myth. Rocky, Fernald, Mound, Ashtabula, Columbus, Test Area North, they were the low-hanging fruit, if you will. We're dealing now with the really hard stuff. Yeah, in reality, yes, tank farms and the waste that we're dealing with at Hanford, Savannah River, Idaho, is really difficult. But everything looks impossibly hard looking while it's in front of you. Everybody thinks that the cleanup we did at Rocky, Fernald, and Mound was a piece of cake. I'll tell you, we didn't know what we were going to do with the residues at Rocky. We didn't know what we were going to do with the special nuclear materials, but we figured it out along the way. So think of this as a challenge that we've figured out once. We have to figure out how we do it again. Choose to be accountable and resist playing the part of the victim. EM does have an opportunity to return to its leadership position. EM's reputation can again be defined by its cutting-edge contracting strategy and project execution. But we need to act, and we need to act now and boldly to get this job done. We need to stop this growing red ink. As the congressman today said, there's going to be a time when folks back in Washington say, that's too big. And we need to find it within ourselves and within each other that we can live up to this challenge, and we can and will succeed. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Paul. Next up, we have Keith Klein. I actually knew Keith when he was the RL manager, but today I think he's going to talk about his time at WIP and getting that facility up and running. Thank you.
All right. Good to see all these folks hanging in there. You know, the more you learn about I'm talking about WIP, and it's really a story of science, perseverance, regulatory frontiers, and politics. And the more you learn about it, really, the more remarkable it becomes. And the story is complete with lots of drama, lessons learned, and including lessons that still apply today, and hopefully can inspire, even with these challenges that remain that may seem insurmountable. That does work. So, you know, a lot of you probably weren't around for much of the early history of WIP, and a lot of that serves as a foundation, too, for the lessons that Tom talked about, that Paul mentioned, and leading to the whole importance of partnerships and cooperation and alignment and so forth. But, you know, remember, this was the world's first deep geologic repository. The world's first. And it was conceived back in 1957, basically, by the National Academy of Sciences, saying, you know, we should isolate the waste from all these operations into salt formations deep underground. That started a search. Lyons, Kansas was identified as a site for the first repository. As they explored it, they found all these, it was pockmarked with holes. It started going down the tubes. And there's a state senator, Joe Grant, in New Mexico. And, you know, the Carlsbad area had been set with a lot of boom-bust cycles, potash mining, oil and gas, and so forth. And he's, you know, there may be something here. He got together with the New Mexico delegation, and that's how it really all started. They put together a coalition, and they wanted this. They advocated for it. 1974, the atomic energy, and that was in the early 70s. So 1974, Congress acted and, the AEC they selected Carlsbad, the area southeast Carlsbad, about 26 miles from Carlsbad, as the site for exploration and investigation. There was a lot of back and forth, things going on. How do you isolate waste? How do you design it? How do you prove that the waste will stay there for these periods of time? How do you regulate it? What processes do we use? None of this has ever been done before. And recall, too, the Atomic Energy Commission self-regulating at that point. So a lot of the things are used to working in an era of secrecy and just being able to do what they wanted to do, when they wanted to do it, where they wanted to do it. As things started progressing, there was some back and forth about the mission. And Secretary Schlesinger said, this could become a high-level waste repository. Next thing you know, the delegation's getting excited. Even longtime nuclear advocate Pete Domenici started waiting. I don't know, this may be premature to be doing this. Concerns started being raised. Schlesinger said, okay, well, we'll give you the veto. New Mexico will give you veto power over this. Next thing you know, AEC starts backing off from that. We can't quite do that. Delegation gets re-energized, concerned. In the interest of time, I'm going to maybe take a little license here and cut to the chase of a few different things here. But the story is 1981, all right, so 1979, Congress intervenes, sets down some ground rules, try to resolve this. 1981, the shaft is drilled at WIP, but there's still some more issues. Things are moving out pretty fast. Then Attorney General Udall from New Mexico sues. There's some settlement agreements. People agreed to consult and cooperate. The state was allowed to independently monitor. Public was allowed to be allowed to comment, and a commitment to funding some highway upgrades. But then again, it still wasn't quite enough. So 1982, Congress passed the Nuclear Waste Policy Act, which further specified EPA, designated EPA as the chief regulatory authority and the one that was going to certify compliance with the regs. So things are moving along, starting to happen, it's getting developed. All of a sudden, 1988, as things are getting close, Governor Cecil Andrus, state of Idaho, who was receiving all the waste from Rocky Flats, sent state troopers out to the border, blocked trains at the border, said, we're not taking any more of this waste from Rocky Flats. So, we know there's a place it's going to go. It's not going to stay here. So you need to get WIP open. Well, this energizes Secretary Watkins. All the, things get moving again. And so come, in the meantime, and you'll see this in the next slide, things in Santa Fe are heating up, which is kind of a hotbed of opposition. So in 1994, Secretary Watkins announces the opening of a test phase and asks the Department of Interior to administratively transfer land. Well, again, things are moving out quicker. The state isn't comfortable. What the heck is going on here? Then Attorney General Udall sues. Bill Richardson, who was a congressman at the time from New Mexico, joins in the lawsuit opposing all this is going on. Courts file a preliminary injunction saying, hey, it can't ship. So that results in another round of congressional intervention, namely what's called Limited Land Withdrawal Act, 1982. Mandates DOE compliance, says feds are going to pay $20 million a year for 14 years. Then it was went through another period. So I forgot to point out, in 1989, the facility was completed. Everything was done. So then you go back a span of 10 years, 1989 to 1999. The facility is treading water. It's all dressed up and ready to go. The only thing standing in the way is basically people, politics, process. It's physically, it's ready. The workers are there. Now, a big challenge to the people at the site, how do we keep folks busy? How do we keep it active? It's all starting to close, maintain a readiness, and so forth. So Finally, 1999, 10 years after construction is complete, voila, the site is ready to operate. So, and I'll come back to that in a minute, that first day of operation. In 2019, 20 years later, it's been operating for 20 years. Oppositional whip, again, for those of you who aren't around, you know, it was an interesting time. It's funny, they slide on the deep left, one of the signs that says, "Dump the crap in Washington, D.C., not in New Mexico." Another one, Sign of the Times, and this goes back to this whole interface between science, technology, our form of government. You know, it's easy to instill fear. It just takes a good cartoon. Something entirely different to develop trust and confidence in the kind of partnerships that underline major successes in the EM program. I love the cartoon on the top right that says, you know, he's hugging the lady, "Darling, what is it?" And he says, "Gosh, I almost forgot about WHIP." And then below it says, "Remember, there's a WHIP route near you." So, you know, this is kind of what we're dealing with out there. And as engineers, you know, we don't necessarily think like that or put our minds in the same space as the general populace. So, again, remember, none of this ever happened before. Uncharted territory, frontiers on many different fronts. On the science front, there's a fellow named Dr. Wendell Wirt from Sandia. Sandia was designated the chief technical advisor for this project. It was assisted by Los Alamos National Lab, by a number of different, all the other DOE labs, a bunch of universities, engineering and consulting firms, a lot of different parties. Developing performance assessments, approved compliance. Another frontier was in the area of public involvement and the Carlsbad Citizens for Energy Development, promoting the project and attending hundreds of hearings, often greatly outnumbered by project opponents. Huge opposition in northern New Mexico, particularly in Santa Fe area. And even back in the 1970s, there was a bill proposed by the state legislature to block WHIP that was narrowly defeated by a House vote, 36-34. That would have at least put a major obstacle in it then. On the regulatory and legal front, I mean, you can just look at the acronyms, all the different authorities, agencies involved in the licensing, transportation, land withdrawal, OSHA, you know, industrial standards, and nothing like this has ever been done in the world. So, a lot of landmark events. So let me just then turn to finally 1999. And, you know, the opening was significant from many perspectives. I'll just quote something from the EM site. An estimated 500 people were on site in the early morning hours of March 26, 1999. After a fog delay the prior day, hours of waiting, everyone was tired and cold, but that didn't matter when, at 3:30 a.m., the lights of the truck were spotted, cheers and applause quickly broke out. This was at the site itself with the workers. You know, I was out there with Mayor Gary Perkowski and a police squad car. We met the shipment before it got to WHIP, drove through the city of Carlsbad. And I swear to God, townspeople out on the site, out on the streets, cheering, clapping, holding up signs. It was just unfreaking believable. Then to go out at the site at 3:30 in the morning, all the workers there, and just like the site said, I mean, it was, you know, talking about passion in favor of getting something done, and seeing these workers have been there 10 years waiting for this day. And they're cheering and applauding, and I swear to God, crying. So it's all true. Things to point out on this slide, though, you look at the people there, Senator Pete Domenici on the far left, Secretary Bill Richardson, the secretary when WHIP got open, previously as a congressman that sued. Later he's become the governor of New Mexico that further put restrictions on what could ship to WHIP. Of course, next to him, DOE hired hand. Representative Joe Skeen after that, Senator Jeff Bingaman, who then later became a proponent after leading a lawsuit against it when he was the New Mexico Attorney General. Carlsbad Mayor Gary Proskowski, and of course missing from this is about 5,000 other people that all contributed to getting this open. So this comes back, and I'm winding down here, but just about perseverance and coordination. You look at 42 years from concept to reality of it becoming open. 42 years. Now it's been operating for 20 years. This is learn as you go siting. Performance assessments, political, public involvement, lawmaking, intervention, management processes. Talk about alignment. Surviving many leadership changes. And again, I guess this comes to what you might call the mid-levels of the bureaucracy and the people at the site, the community, the regulators, and the power of this alignment. Because you got to be able to survive these changes in administration. And I got to credit, as an engineer, I worked for Tom Grumbly as his chief of staff, and I was his nuke in the front office. What an eye-opener. Such insights into how this operated beyond a technical level. And that's, I think, one of the failings of our system sometimes is we promote all us technical people. We don't necessarily have the speaking skills, the political insights, other things like that. But, it only takes a few whumps over the top of the front of the head to make you realize that these problems are mostly, and someone else said it, these are people problems. And we can do all this stuff technically, but getting there is the hard part. Multiple players, and I just want to single out a few of the DOE folks that some are here, some not. George Dowles, Ralph Stein, John Arthur, both no longer with us, Mark Fry, Mary Ann Sullivan, Inez, who's at Los Alamos, Dave Moody, Paul Detweiler, Joe Franco, Todd Schrader, and many of those in the audience who contributed, played a part in these roles. And special credit to the community, because there's just absolutely no doubt in my mind that community leaders like Bob Forrest, John Heaton, who's in the audience, and others, they're the ones without, and it's not just support, it was advocacy, it was activism, it was pushing, it was making this work in the delegation and keeping people aligned. Just a couple things on the significance of WIP. It's obviously important to the cleanup to date. You've heard before, 12,000 shipments since it opened 20 years ago, 175,000 containers in place. It is obviously uniquely capable of doing things. It enabled the completion of Rocky Flats without anywhere to take the transuranic waste and not be able to ship it to Idaho. This couldn't have happened. It's a major, obviously, contributing cleanups at Idaho, Savannah River, Los Alamos, Hanford. And the importance of the future. It is a unique disposal capabilities. It's license permitted for transuranic waste. Technically, it probably could do a lot more. We'll see, who knows. Right now, though, it's a very critical role. But, it's also living, working proof that we can design, regulate, and operate a deep geologic disposal system for isolating long-lived nuclear waste safely, productively, and efficiently. So just in closing, some lessons learned from all this. In the spirit of ISMS feedback and improvement, I'd call out a few things. That it isn't easy, but it can happen. It takes perseverance, coordination, alignment, the community, things you've heard about by the other speakers. Good science is essential, but it's not sufficient. The fear factor, you just got to take that into account and deal with it the best we can. Hopefully, in the end, reason, logic, if we can communicate it and make it accessible to the general public, will prevail. Operating under a microscope. Incidents are very costly. You look at the 2014 incident, and despite no major injuries or significant exposures, set us back a few years. Institutional commitment. Good people working to persevere, coordinate, partner, work changing levels of management. You just got to have it. There's no reason we can't apply those lessons learned to the challenges going forward. And whether it's Yucca Mountain, finishing up Hanford, these other sites. So with that, I thank you and appreciate the opportunity to talk about WIP.
Next up, we have Jack Craig. Spent a long time in our Ohio offices and also our Savannah River offices, and I think today is going to talk about DWPF.
Thank you. I grabbed your water there, Todd. Good morning. I guess it's almost afternoon now, so I know we're running a little bit behind schedule. So I wanted to just say first that I'm really proud to be part of this panel. I spent most of my, up to this point, my professional career in the EM program. I came into the Department of Energy in 1988 and really worked in the EM program up to my leaving the federal government in February of 18. So the last year and a half I've been working in the private sector, but still associated with the program. So proud to be part of this. So I only have one picture, a couple pictures here to show, but before I got into DWPF, I just wanted to say that, you know, I have some kind of professional connection to everybody on this panel here today. Tom mentioned Plant 7 at Fernald, certainly one of the most memorable days of my career also. And so I think for about the 10th time now, Tom, I apologize for that day. And it was a good lesson learned, so Todd, you'll never have to worry about pushing a button to do an implosion at any of our projects. So I do want to say, Tom mentioned about the interaction with the public and the creation of the Citizens Advisory Boards, and Paul did also, but my personal experience at Fernald and Mound, if we did not have the collaboration with the community through the advisory board, which also included our regulators, both federal and state, we would never have completed that project. So never underestimate the power of collaboration with the communities and the regulators. With Seth and Rick, I've worked with Seth, I don't know how many years now, but it may have started at the Mound transition with Mayor Church. Worked with ECA a lot, but really with Rick, I've worked with Rick a couple times. I was at Savannah River in 2010. As an acting manager, and then the 3 years I was there from 2016 to 2018, really focusing on, I think the biggest thing we worked on was the workforce development. And really, I think we're proud of that, and I think it's continuing today to help address the workforce of the future at Savannah River. Keith, Keith mentioned his WIP. I mentioned this to Keith earlier today. I was on an elevator with Secretary Richardson in March of 1999 at Fernald. He was there for a celebration of our completion of our safe shutdown program. He got a phone call on his cell phone. He picked it up. It was Keith Klein on the phone saying, it was, you got the permits or you were getting the first waste shipment. I'm not sure which one it was, but that was the phone call to the secretary saying pretty significant progress being made. And I can remember the secretary being happy, and he asked Keith, what do you want to do next? And I didn't hear what the answer was, and he hung it up and he goes, I think he said he wants to go to Disneyland. So let's go to DWPF. So before I get started, I know that there's a lot of collaboration over the years between DWPF, Savannah River, West Valley, Hanford. I even talked to some Catholic University representatives here today. So I'd like, before I get started, if you could stand up, if you were involved in the design, commissioning, construction, operation, funding, or oversight of DWPF, could you please stand? Thanks, I appreciate it. So Todd mentioned as part of the EM update there, the priorities for the EM program. Certainly, management of liquid high-level waste has been the top priority of the program for many years. Savannah River, over the years of the production of nuclear materials, generated approximately 36 million gallons of liquid high-level waste.
That waste material was contained in 51 below-grade storage tanks. So the risk there was naturally the release to the environment and the risk to the health and safety of the workers. So early on, in I believe the late 70s, maybe even before that, studies were underway to decide the best way to immobilize that material, get it out of the tanks, put it in a safer form, and then eventually close the tanks. So that, through that process, a borosilicate glass matrix was selected, and design was initiated in the late 70s, and eventually construction, groundbreaking occurred in 1983. Through the next, I believe, 13 years, construction was completed in the late 80s. Startup testing began in the early 90s. Water runs and other material was processed through the system. Non-radioactive canisters were actually produced. And then in 1996, the first waste container was created, and that facility has operated successfully for the next plus 20 years up till today. I was fortunate enough to be at Savannah River for the 20th year anniversary, and I think Jim Owendorf may have said it yesterday that I really didn't do anything, but I was there at the right time. Didn't something Jim said yesterday? So a couple other milestones here. So the melters that used in DWPF are 75-ton melters. They are designed, I believe, for a 6 to 8 year lifespan. The first melter operated from 1996 through 2002, so it did operate for 6 years. In September of 2010, we, under the Recovery Act, we did some upgrades to DWPF. Actually, bubbler technology was added, which really increased the throughput of the facility and allowed us to produce more canisters. In 2012, the highest canister production in any fiscal year occurred, with 277 canisters being produced. And in December of 2016, the 4,000th canister was poured at DWPF. So if you look in the lower left corner of that, you see two other buildings actually next to DWPF. Those are the glass waste storage buildings. So the canisters that are produced in DWPF actually go to those facilities for long-term storage, awaiting disposal at the federal repository. If you look up in the upper right-hand corner of that picture, you can see another facility. That is the SWPF facility being constructed today, actually going through startup today. And when operational, that facility will help the site and the throughput of DWPF and the liquid waste program, and will allow about a 6-fold increase in the production capability to empty the tanks. And once again, I'm sure as many of you know, the whole issue here is to remove the material, put it in a safer form, and eventually allow us to close those high-level waste tanks. Actually, to date, like I said earlier, we had 51 underground storage tanks full of material. We have actually emptied 8 of those, closed 8 of those, so we have, 42 or 43 remaining. And the SWPF facility being constructed will help us accelerate that closure. As of today, or as of last August, we had produced 4,207 canisters. A tremendous accomplishment. Once again, it proves that we in the EM program can design, construct, commission, and operate large, complex nuclear facilities. And I was proud to be at Savannah River as part of this operation, and I want to congratulate all of you who had a part in that too. So thank you.
Finally, our final panelist, it's an honor to welcome Congressman Hastings. He's traveled back from Washington, the real Washington, to be with us today. In addition to founding Cleanup Caucus, he's certainly a driving force behind the Hanford Cleanup and the B reactor and the creation of the Manhattan National Park. Thank you.
Thank you, Todd. Well, it's a pleasure to be here. I'm not sure if his remark finally means anything or not, but I am the last speaker here. I'll mention that. It is a pleasure to join this august body here, and their remarks were more kind of in the weeds on EM cleanup and so forth. My remarks will be more at the 30,000 foot level, and frankly from a perspective of a member of Congress, because we don't know all of the details about how all of this stuff works, but we know that it's a federal responsibility. We know that it had to get done. Now, there's a reference earlier, in fact, there's a question earlier about the cleanup caucus to my successor, Dan Newhouse. And I thought I'd start by explaining how the cleanup caucus started. I was elected in 1994. Is this? No, this doesn't work at all. I was elected in 1994. That was a contract with the America election. It was a wave election, and it resulted in Republicans taking control of the U.S. House for the first time in 40 years. So it was a dramatic change from what the politics were prior to that time. And I was looking around. I obviously had the Hanford site in my district, and I served 8 years in the Washington legislature, and even though it was in that area, my legislative district did not include Hanford. There was 2 other members that worked at Hanford, and so I didn't focus too much on Hanford when I was in the legislature, but all of a sudden, I had to focus on Hanford because I was elected to represent that area. So when I got to, between the time I was elected and looked around, I did a little homework on the cleanup sites, and I found out there's a very small constituency in this country to clean up nuclear waste. There's essentially 4 major sites. There are some other sites, but there's essentially 4 major sites. Hanford being the primary one because they were totally into cleanup at that time. But there is Savannah River, Oak Ridge, and Idaho. Those are the 4 biggies at that time. I'm not going to say Rocky Flats wasn't important, but it wasn't as big as what those were. Well, it just turned out that at 3 of those 4 sites were congressmen that were elected in 1994. Lindsey Graham was elected representing Savannah River, and then right across the border in Georgia, Charlie Norwood was newly elected, and Zach Wamp was newly elected from Oak Ridge, and me. And in Idaho was Mike Crapo, now Senator Mike Crapo, in his 2nd term. So we were relatively new to all of this, and all of us were elected with the idea that we're fiscal conservatives, but we know the importance of prioritizing cleaning this up. So we decided to get together. In fact, one of the first guys I met during orientation was Lindsey Graham with this idea in mind. And so we decided to get together and say, listen, we're going to have to work together on this. I had heard rumors, by the way, before I was elected that in all the budgetary process, all the senators would steal the money, take money away from Hanford or this or that, and we decided that wasn't the way we wanted to go. We wanted to make sure that this cleanup went across the site as best as possible. So we sat down with Speaker Newt Gingrich, and Newt, being Newt, said, form a task force. He was big on task force. If you have a problem, get a task force. So we formed a task force, and as a result of that, out of that came the Cleanup Caucus, with the idea of trying to educate other members of Congress and staff in both the House and the Senate on the importance of cleaning up these sites. Now it worked out very well, because in our 2nd term, Lindsey remained on the Armed Services Committee. That's the policy-making part of EM cleanup. Zach Wamp went to Appropriations. I'm not sure if he served on Energy and Water that first terms. And I went to Rules. And so we had, at least in the House, it covered from a policy standpoint of having a voice on major committees that were dealing with these issues. And so that became very important in my 3rd term when the decision was made to create the Office of River Protection. The big issue at Hanford, as we all know, is the tanks. And by the way, let me get off to an aside here. We talk about 56 million gallons of waste in tanks underground. How do you quantify that, for goodness sakes? 56 million gallons? I mean, you know, in this town, you throw millions around like it doesn't mean anything. In fact, you throw billions around like it doesn't mean anything. But nevertheless, that's a lot. And so I asked my staff, Jessica Gleason, who was here, I says, we got to figure out a way to show how much 56 million gallons is. So she got a hold of the architect of the Capitol and we wanted to find out how big the House chamber was. He said, why do you want to know that? So anyway, long story short, we discovered with their help that 56 million gallons that is sitting in underground tanks at Hanford would fill more than 20 House chambers. That's how big that problem is. And we should not diminish how big that problem is. So when we created the Office of River Protection, that was to take care of those tanks' waste, and as you know, that process is ongoing. But there's a silver lining out of all of that. Because we created ORP, RL, Richland Operations, didn't have that authority anymore. And I remember Keith was head of RL at that time, and he came in my office. He says, we have a plan called the River Corridor Project, and that is to clean up the river corridor. And I have to tell you, when Keith sat down in my office, I said, boy, this sounded good to me. Again, 30,000 feet level. But that project, nobody talks about that much. Why? Because it is a successful project. It is completed, I think, ahead of time and under budget. The one glitch is the 324 building, which is something that was not anticipated. But so as a result of creating an ORP, there has been other success at Hanford. So now, let me then go to, that's kind of how the cleanup caucus. And by the way, when Paul, you were talking about the 10-year plan to accelerate, we in the Nuclear Cleanup Caucus embraced that idea with one caveat. We said, okay, from a policy standpoint, we'll help you clean up these sites, but we can't reduce EM spending. The idea is to reduce these sites to free up dollars so that we can clean up all the other major sites. We are very fortunate to have, and I think a large part is because the Cleanup Caucus educated the appropriators and others that this is a process that we need to go through. And to my knowledge, at least until the time I was left there 5 years ago, that was the case. So that leads us then to kind of a legacy, if you will, and the legacy is the Manhattan National Park, consisting of Hanford, Oak Ridge, and Los Alamos, and specifically the B reactor. And all that wisdom, by the way, did not come from the top. All that wisdom came from those that worked at the B reactor, because the idea of the river corridor was to cocoon the reactors, lock them up for, what, 75 years, something like that, Keith, that's what it is, and then check and see if it's leaking. But somebody said, we shouldn't do that with the B reactor, that's too significant. And there were those that were involved in that in, well, the late 80s and early 90s that said, we've got to preserve the B reactor. Well, fortunately, all that process came to a fruition when the Manhattan Project, or National Park, was created, and that work is going on. And for those of you that haven't been to the B reactor, it is really something to see. I was there with Secretary Salazar several years ago. In fact, I've been there several times, and I remember, I think it was the time when I was with Secretary Salazar, I was sitting there in the control room, and you see the control room, and one can anticipate what happened when they said, okay, we're going to go hot. Is it going to work? And I remember asking some of the people there, I says, why don't you show me the computer that you guys use to put all this together? And he said, computer? And then somebody said, pulled out a slide rule. And so I said, you know, that has to be a prop. Every time somebody comes through here and sits down in that chair, say, I want to show you the computer that put this together, and it's a slide rule. So at any rate, all of that I think, is part of the legacy, but there's no question long term. There's no question long term that the EM has had some success. And I mentioned the closure of of Rocky Flats. In fact, at one of our meetings, Cleanup Caucus meetings, Rocky Flats was presenting their final report, and I think Marty Schneider asked the question because there was 2 or 3 55-gallon barrels of waste that hadn't been disposed of. Now that's pretty small, but the question is, what are you going to do with that? And I thought to myself, my God, if we're asking questions about 3 55-gallon drums of waste, I think we've had some pretty good success. Well, of course, that happened at obviously some of the other sites. So finally, let me congratulate all of you that are involved with that. I've seen a number of people that I've interacted with in the time that I was in Congress. And let me close by being unabashedly self-serving. I had a book written about me. I didn't write the book, but I collaborated with the book. And it's titled Doc Hastings, 20 Years of Turmoil. And the reason I mention it here is because the history of that is in each of my 10 terms in Congress, in which Hanford played a big role in as far as how the funding and how we put some of that together at some of that time. So it might be of interest to you. You can get the book, WSU Press, that's Washington State University Press. Just go WSU Press and it'll show up. Or you can go to dochastingsbook.com and it'll refer you. So, as I mentioned, I got elected in 1994 as a conservative Republican and as a capitalistic pig, and so I want to make sure that you guys go out and buy that book. And finally, let me just say I've been very blessed to have had a great staff, and a lot of them are still involved in the cleanup at Hanford. And I would be remiss if I didn't mention them, not in any particular order. But Doug Riggs, who was my first legislative director, was the one that came up with a lot of these ideas that led to the Cleanup Caucus and ORP and so forth. And I know that he was involved in the industry for a while. I haven't talked to him for a year or so. And then, of course, Todd Young, Jeff Markey, I know was still involved in the overall industry, and Jessica Gleason. All of them worked on all of that, and to whatever success I may have had is large part because of the work that they did for me. So thank you very much for having me, and I wish you all the best.